Welcome back. It's nice to see there wasn't a mass exodus. Speaking of exodus, we'll start. But before starting today, offer some clarifications and a correction. I had mentioned T.E. Lawrence last week, and he's on the slide and all that, but I don't think I explicitly mentioned that he, of course, is Lawrence of Arabia, Colonel Lawrence. That's number one, played by Peter O'Toole. Now, thanks to one of you, I was able to also give short, but mention the Turkish War of Independence and the creation of Turkey, which I kept and I referred to as Mustafa Kemal as the leader, which he was. And one of the slides mentioned Ataturk. Again, I didn't use the term Ataturk because actually he didn't get that name until the 1930s. That was when Turkey introduced surnames. There are not surnames in Arabic or in on Turkish. And the National Assembly conferred on Mustafa Kemal the surname Ataturk, or Father of the Turks, this is the rubric in which he became famous. But this was only 3 years before his death, so it wasn't under this guy's Benghazi, it was more like this. Actually, he was a very handsome fellow. My students have mentioned Ataturk, Nasser, and actually Gaddafi in his youth. But I will say Ataturk aged better than Gaddafi. Another item, when you see Arab names, for instance, well, in fact, the most important item, the most important item, I was mistaken about who played Faisal in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. It was, of course, Alec Guinness, because one needs a more dour countenance, and Alec provides that to the hilt. A note, though, on Arabic spelling. There is no agreed upon transliteration, completely agreed upon, from Arabic to English. And so when you go across various works in the region, etc., you will find different spellings. Well, that's what happens. So for instance, Faisal has also, F-E-I-S-A-L, has also been rendered as F-A-I-S-A-L and F-A-Y-S-A-L. Now, this has become a problem in one sense because Arabs will use different transliterations. And one of the issues in terms of 9/11 national security is a number of people have been put on lists because of spelling issues. Because different spellings could say come from intelligence, and then this must be that person, which they are not. Last, Tom Schwartz, because someone spilled coffee here, and Tom has standards, didn't want to get his coat messed up, is sitting in the back of the room, and he'll be leaving early because he is a man in great demand. He is doing a guest lecture for one of our colleagues at noon, so it's not just that he's bored. There may be other issues. As you may discern, my approach to this, to the Arab Spring, is a longish one. Not really long from historical standards, where I really stretch back to the beginning of the 20th century. The reason for this is that I see both long-term and short-term issues that have prompted the current unrest in the region. The long-term issue really is that the Arabs have experienced a century of disappointments. And that's why I actually started with the Arab Spring of 1919. It's also nice bookends. But even with short periods of elation, such as 1919, that were caused by both external and internal forces, it has tended to be one of disappointment. When combined, these have influenced their current worldview of who they are and how they view the rest of the world. Now, last week, we looked at the first 3 decades of the 20th century where old identities, in particular Ottomanism, went by the by and was replaced by Arab nationalism. This was not necessarily voluntary. In the main, the rise of Arab nationalism was a secular movement that tended to take Islam out of the public square or public sphere, although Islam has remained very much in the private sphere, which we had tended to forget. But this shift was forced on the region by the West and the imposition of European rule had stifled Arab aspirations. Today, I will look at the bumpy road to gain independence from European rule and the transition to the strongman in independent North Africa and the Middle East. By the mid-1930s, both the backdrop and events on the ground changed the Middle East. After a series of demonstrations and rioting in Iraq, the British did grant independence in 1931 and sponsored Iraq's joining of the League of Nations. They didn't sponsor for Egypt when Egypt supposedly became independent earlier. So Iraq was the first Arab state to join the League. But there was a caveat. As you should know by now, there are always caveats. And the caveat was the continued British military presence in Iraq, along with some very lucrative, the continuing of lucrative oil leases. I should, as a footnote, Turkey joined the League of Nations the same year. Iraqi independence reinvigorated Arab nationalist activity through the region, culminating the disturbances in Syria and Egypt in 1936 and the Arab revolt in Palestine from 1936 to 1939. Let us first look at Palestine. A major concern for both Jews and Arabs in Palestine was the question of Jewish immigration. In the early years of the mandate through 1926, immigration rates were growing amid active Arab hostility. For example, the Jaffa riots in 1921. Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill attempted to assuage Arab resistance to immigration in his 1922 white paper, where he supported continuing immigration. But the immigration should not exceed the absorptive capacity of the land. Man has a knack for words. That mean what? The absorptive capacity of the land. This is, of course, the same kind of perception George Will talks about, where a recession is when your neighbor is out of work and where a depression is when you're out of work. This did not satisfy Arabs. nor did it satisfy Jews. But it did initially cut down on immigration levels. But by the late 1920s, with the onset of the Great Depression, I use enormous. Oh, where is my? Oh, here it is. Immigration declined to a trickle. You can see this chart. In 1921, this about a little less than 10,000 became the quota. But then you have it skyrocketing here and then plummeting in the later 1920, 1927. Now, of course, this is with the onset of the Great Depression. If things were hard in Glasgow or even later in New York, the last place you'd want to go to for economic betterment would be Palestine. It was dirt poor, and life was tough. You were either on a farm or, as most people, settled in the cities. In fact, with this, in the late 1920s, people said, you know, this may work. Why? Because people weren't coming. There is strong evidence that Zionist sentiment among world Jewry at the time was not very strong. This included people in Germany and other places, Russia, were busy assimilating themselves within their own societies. Things had really looked up. Things were much better. Did anti-Semitism exist? Yes. Was it of the earlier variety of pogroms, etc.? No. So in fact, in 1929, the World Zionist Organization changed its name to the Jewish Agency to show a broader appeal. I should also note at this conference, this also was at a time when there were more riots in Palestine. The Jewish Agency created, or the Zionist executive, under Ben-Gurion, established a paramilitary force called the Haganah. And furthermore, they decreed that only Jews could work on the land that had been acquired by the agency or the World Zionist Organization. This actually did not take. Most immigrants came into the cities. Arabs still continue to work on the land in Jewish areas. But what changed the dynamics of events in Palestine was the rise of Adolf Hitler and the advent of persecution of German Jews that, of course, led to the Holocaust. This was the game change. And it was only with this heightened persecution in Germany and to a somewhat lesser extent in other Central European states that you see immigration rates soar. The movement of Jews to Palestine was exacerbated, frankly, by the unwillingness of other states to accept Jewish refugees, including the United States. Though I should point at, in the later 1930s, at a congressional committee, two groups argued against increasing the quotas for Jews for immigration in the United States. One was the AMA, because they knew that they were all doctors. They actually said that. They're all doctors. Most of them are doctors. The second was actually the Jewish Agency, because they wanted immigration skewed to Palestine. This became actually the basis. Well, in 1935, when you see immigration rates go up to 66,000 people, over 66,000. This was the spark that set off the Arab Revolt of 1936. Over the course of the next 3 years, up to 7,000 Arabs took an active fighting role in the revolt, but they were supported by the wider Arab community via general strikes, especially in transport, dock workers, the post, other places, civil service, and business closures. The British countered by increasing their military strength in Palestine to 50,000 soldiers, who were then augmented by 20,000 Jewish police, 15,000 Haganah fighters, and 2,000 Irgun fighters. The Irgun was a splitter group from the Haganah that did not feel the Haganah was doing enough. They used harsh measures, including that resulted in the killing of 5,000 Arabs, the razing of many houses and businesses, and placing 12,000 Arabs in concentration camps. As with every other crisis, conflict, or riot in Palestine, the British established commissions to make inquiries. This is just a riot inquiry, a very reactive existence. One of them, the Peel Commission, characterized the revolt as reflecting the growth in Arab nationalism, actually recognized Arab nationalism, and cast serious doubts on the viability of the mandate as it had been constructed. Even David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish executive, said that Arabs were fighting dispossession, the fear of not losing land, but of losing the homeland of the Arab people, which others want to turn into the homeland of the Jewish people. So they're cognizant of that. And here you see not just a Jewish-Muslim clash, but a Jewish-Arab clash, because Christian Arabs joined their Muslim brethren in the revolt. And what you see taking place is that Jewish-Muslim antagonism is not age-old. The kind of bitter antagonism that we may see today is really a phenomena of the 20th century, and to a great extent, almost all of it, based on the Palestine question. The British tabled two proposals to partition the mandate, but these were rejected by both sides. The Jews were, in fact, talking about, the Jewish Agency was talking about both Palestine and Transjordan as part of what they saw their mandate to be. But with the increasing threat of war in Europe and not able to deal with significant Arab unrest in the region, the British now attempted to placate the Arabs by, again, severely limiting Jewish immigration. And this was partially successful, but not completely so, because the Jews established underground immigration operations. But by 1939, the Jewish population had risen to about 25% of the total population. And so with the coming of the war and with Arab sentiment, most Arabs in Palestine still look to see an independent Arab state coming into being in the future. Now, in other parts of the region, coinciding with this, in 1936, both the Popular Front government in France actually offered Syria and Lebanon independence. But the treaties that resulted from this, the negotiations, were turned down by the National Assembly in France. They would be taken care of a little later. In Egypt, a new Anglo-Egyptian treaty was agreed to by which Egypt would be more independent and finally join the League of Nations. But the British continued to control the Suez Canal and maintain military bases throughout the country. One of the things that they did establish was that the military academy would now accept native Egyptians. I mean, this is not bad. And in fact, the first class in the military academy included Gamal Abdel Nasser. With the advent of the war, though, British control in the Middle East reached its apex. Nope. I won't do that yet. In Iraq, there was a revolt against the British, nationalist factions that sided with Germany. Primarily not so much with Germany, but against Britain. And you know, in many cases in the world, including our own, you end up with some strange allies, because it's not the ally that you're concerned, it's that SOB who you don't like. And if your ally doesn't like that SOB, then he's your ally, he or she. Since now the British soon put this down, changed the government, and essentially imposed military rule. Since the Iraqi insurgents had received assistance from now the Vichy governments in Syria, British forces then occupied both Syria and Lebanon. In 1943, the Lebanese politicians created a new national pact. Political society or arrangements would be based on a confessional state, using the 1932 census in dividing up the principal offices of government. And these offices were reflected or reflected the religious composition of the area in 1932. So with this, the president would be a Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the National Assembly coming from the Shia community. Now, the country did not secure independence. That is, they remained to be occupied until 1945, but the British supported this independence. I mention this because the 1932 census in Lebanon was the last census in Lebanon. There has been no head count since. And there have been vast changes in the composition of the population of Lebanon over the years. And of course, this became the root of civil wars in Lebanon in the 1970s and 80s, and still haunts the region. So, root number one for the Arab Spring. You can write it down. It'll be on the test. But don't worry about spelling. In Iran, the British overthrew Reza Shah, who had come to power after World War I, and placed his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, on the throne. But at the same time, they occupied the southern part of the country while the Russians occupied the northern part of the country as a way of securing, this was after German invasion of Russia, securing supply routes. In Egypt, where the Middle East Command was centered, and this is an interesting story, Middle East Command. Middle East Command for British forces had been stationed in India, which makes sense. East Near East, Middle East, Far East, right? From a European perspective. Something Americans have never had a problem with. So in terms of, are we an extension of Europe? That's one sign. So when you go to the library, under the Dewey Decimal System, and it continued, if you don't look for Middle East, you can, and they're very gracious because librarians do that for you. They'll say, see Near East, because that had developed at the turn of the, under the Dewey Decimal System. But what happened, Middle East Command went from India to Cairo. British are cheap on paper. If you've ever been there, toilet paper is a good thing to notice. It's very thin. Just as a friend of mine said, it just moves around. But with this, they just X'd out the headquarters Delhi and put in Cairo. Now, this and the Middle East Supply Agency, which now controlled all trade in the region from Turkey to North Africa, as long as allies were there, to Aden, over to, actually, including Iran, controlled the economy, trade, allocation of resources, etc. So, and it was in this environment that Americans really first became involved, American people, soldiers, civilians, etc. Number of academics came out of what became known in 1942 as the Anglo-American Middle East Supply Agency. Now, with all this hubbub, it is interesting, I think, to note that Palestine was tranquil. In fact, Palestine was the most tranquil that it had been since the inception of the mandate. Jewish Palestinians swallowed their frustrations with the British and took up the King's sovereign, joining the British forces in droves, well over 25,000. Including almost all the Haganah. One of the things this resulted in is they got training and became forces. While more reticent in joining the British military, the Arabs did not hamper the Allied war effort. An exception was Al-Hajj Amin al-Hassani. Great name, another great name, Al-Hajj Amin al-Hassani. Who was the Mufti of Jerusalem, who had figured in the Iraqi revolt and moved to Germany and supported, gave speeches in support of Nazi Germany. But few Arabs actively supported the Germans during the war, and things were actually pretty quiet. But while the British now enjoyed complete control in the area, the war was to significantly alter the definition of great powers and limit the freedom and action of European states in the region. Clearly, being occupied by Germany took the aura away from the French in terms of maintaining an empire, and much of empire is based on aura, not just shock and awe. While victorious, the economic strain caused by 6 years of war was to significantly hamper Britain's ability to regain control in the region. And remember, Britain retained rationing well into the 1950s. Both countries and the state, Britain and France, along with the states in the region, now had to contend with other voices and other priorities. These were the United States and the emerging Soviet Union, which constituted the superpowers. The United States was the only country during World War II that made money. We forget that. And the only country whose infrastructure was not hampered. In fact, the infrastructure grew. But in 1945, the British believed that they could heavily influence U.S. foreign policy because we've been there so long. I'm sure they'll defer to us. That was Harold Macmillan's view, at least. Nowhere was the new political reality more evident than in Palestine. World War II and the revelation of the Holocaust changed many facts on the ground. But more importantly, it changed the focus of the discussion about the future of Palestine, the future of the Jews. On the world stage, and especially in the United States, Zionist concerns were now given a much more favorable hearing. And the cry was that something had to be done to deal with Jewish refugees. I think some of you in the room, I did, remember Movietone News, that there were these movie theaters that just ran news in the 40s. And you'd go in and, of course, it was there, pre-television essentially, that the revelation of the Holocaust and the nature of the concentration camps was revealed to Americans and many others. So there was this cry that something had to be done. There were calls from many quarters for the British to do something. And that was led by Harry Truman that demanded immediate British allow 100,000 Jews to immediately go to Palestine, which the British attempted to resist. But the Labour Party, long a staunch supporter of the Jews in Palestine, now changed course and attempted to divert the refugees away from Palestine. In Palestine itself, there was an increasing tempo of violence, principally directed against the British, both military and civilian, by, in fact, Jewish terrorist gangs. And of course, this was capped by the Irgun bombing of the King David Hotel that killed both military and civilian folks. This is downplayed in Jewish historiography, but in fact, it is pretty much agreed upon that the first terrorist activity, the creation, was pushed to a great extent by terrorist activity. And why? Because they said, this cannot go on. That's what terrorists do. It's an untenable situation to attempt to keep the status quo. The British, exhausted by war and unable to contain its terrorist activity, and under increasing pressure from the United States, threw the matter to the new United Nations. And in the United Nations, they came up with the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which came up with this plan. Now, this reflects a new United Nations. Just as the new League of Nations, this was going to change everything. But this is clearly a map by committee, which was 6 sections. Palestine be divided into 6 sections, 3 to each party. Joined here and here. Interlacing. Now, of course, this did not reflect population. The only district in Palestine that had a majority of Jews was the Jaffa district that included Tel Aviv. Every other district had a majority of Arabs. And in the Negev, there are only about 3% of the population being Jewish. Am I correct there? Oh, I'm sorry, 1%. But this was passed very much with pressure from the United States. And in a final vote in November of 1947, there were 33 for, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. Now this, of course, was a very Eurocentric United Nations, a very small United Nations. Both the United States and the Soviet Union supported the plan. Clearly, the Arabs were against the plan. And while the British were against any plan that upset either community. Yes, sir?
What do the colors refer to there?
Oh, I'm sorry. Good point. The areas allocated to Jews is the darker gray or beige. Is that a taupe? And the lighter colors were allocated to the Arabs, with Jerusalem to be under international control. But the center, this is closer to the center of Jewish settlement. Now yes. Paul?
White in the other one, what does that signify?
The white?
Yeah.
This portion here?
No, the West
Jordan
Bank.
and
West Bank. The
West Bank. So that's,
Oh, this was after the war. This was to become part of, as we'll see, Jordan. But what this shows, getting ahead of ourselves, but that's okay. This shows the territory that was gained by Israel during the first Arab-Israeli War. So these three were what were allocated. This is what ostensibly came into being as a result of the three phases, the extended first Arab-Israeli War. Now,
Where are the Golan Heights, Bishop? It looks like the boundary to Syria has.
the Golan Heights are here,
Okay.
part of Syria,
That's down.
in 1947. They weren't taken until 67. And these are the same maps you have. Now, I posit that this is the last colonial solution. That is, and there's been a history of it for the previous 100 years, problems in Europe would be solved in other places. For instance, the British, problems of vets, settled them initially after World War I in Kenya, and then World War II, Rhodesia became a principal settlement for them. Now, this settlement also created another problem that was kind of poo-pooed at the time. Not only do you have majorities not really looked at, but the Negev. Because with the establishment of Israel, you have this split right in the middle of the Arab world. There was controversy of whether to include the Negev. And I actually think if they hadn't included the Negev, it would not have been as severe an issue. But that was, such voices were not heard. In Europe and the United States, the left hailed the vote while the right condemned it. The Israelis were seen as democratic and socialist. That's why the right didn't like it, the socialist part. The Arabs were viewed as decadent monarchies whose principal worth was oil, but we'll still get the oil. The Arabs could be ignored. Now, in Palestine itself, there was quick disintegration of forces. The British forces disintegrated visibly. This is actually one of the worst cases of discipline disintegrating on the ground among British forces. With the declaration of the State of Israel in May of 1948, the surrounding Arab states invaded the new country, which ushered in the first Arab-Israeli war. And here you see Ben-Gurion making the declaration here. The United States was the first to support it, and the Soviet Union was one of the first to support it. Now, the Soviet Union supported it for a similar reason, because they hadn't had any luck with Arab monarchies. Godless communism did not resonate in much of the, as they would call it, that's in quotes, I suppose you have to do, godless communism, didn't support it. Now, in Israel itself, this war is seen as a David and Goliath, pardon the pun, David and Goliath campaign, but that actually wasn't necessarily the case. At the peak of the conflict, the divided Arab forces did not exceed about 25,000 troops, compared with Israeli forces that peaked at over 65,000 men and women. Also, Israel had better access to arms through their underground approaches. Now, the war resulted in a decisive defeat of the Arab armies and of course, Arab Palestinians. Israel emerged with more land, as you can see here. And now you had over 700,000 Arab refugees taking over for the Jewish refugees. So you have one refugee problem created after another one was supposedly solved. In the Arab world, this defeat was called the Al-Nakba, or disaster, and had a major impact on the region in that it prompted more disgust with existing regimes and ushered in a new surge of Arab nationalism. In 1951, fearing that Lebanon and Jordan would sign peace treaties with Israel, the Prime Minister of Lebanon and King Abdullah of Jordan were assassinated. But the revolution that was to have the most impact on the region and the region's relations with the rest of the world was the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. Egypt had contributed the largest military contingent to the war against the new state of Israel. But this was undermined by poor leadership, logistics, and fighting or antagonisms among the various heads of state. This caused widespread anguish among the junior officers in the Egyptian army, including now Major Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was stranded in the Negev, not getting any supplies or ammunition. Now, as one would guess, the spark for this revolution was our friends, the British, who still controlled the Canal Zone. A dispute in the Canal Zone in 1951 led to a British attack on an Egyptian police barracks, killing all inside. Riots spread across the country, including the burning of the Shepherd's Hotel, which had kind of been the symbol of British rule. It has this porte veranda, and Egyptians didn't go up the steps even in 1951. You had these whites in their tropical suits, sometimes pith helmets, sitting on the veranda. King Farouk, who is now seen as a corpulent playboy, attempted to deal with the riots and also to weed out discontented Egyptian officers in the military, but he was too late. On July 22nd, the free officers staged a coup d'etat, leading to Farouk's abdication. There's a picture of Farouk. While the the acknowledged leader was now Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. The better known General Naguib was chosen to head the provisional government. The revolution was acclaimed by crowds and most people outside of the country who applauded Farouk's ouster. All these pictures you may remember of poolside, very fat young women on his arm, etc. It's a very sad case. He didn't start off that way. While not having a distilled ideology, it was clear that the new government was going to continue the trend of secular Arab nationalists. This is kind of in the Turkish tradition. The military was very secular, and the military was essentially now in charge. It immediately focused on three issues: land reform, the building of a high dam at ASWAN, and controlling the Suez Canal. At the time of the coup, or revolt, over 80% of Egypt's population lived on the land. But 90% of the land was owned by only 200 families. This had emerged actually in the 19th century. The initial land reform in 1952 confiscated royal estates, no problem, and they were extensive, and limited land holdings to just over 200 acres, with the landowners being compensated. The landowners weren't pleased. Such compensation, as we see in this country with eminent domain, is never sufficient. Never, never, never. And they and their allies in the WAFT party attempted to resist, but to no avail. And the WAFT was banned. After 2 assassination attempts on Nasser, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been founded in the late 20s, was also banned, and the Communist Party was banned. In fact, later when Khrushchev complained to Nasser about that, he said, "Why are they in jail?" He said, "They're troublemakers." So they still were banned, with many in jail. To complement, there's one story, we'll be behind a bit, but there was a second reform in 1960. But prior to that, in 1958, the Egyptian government, which had emerging large bureaucracy, said, we don't have enough people to value land. So we would like landholders to, in your tax, just declare what the value of your land is, pay the tax on that, which they did. In 1960, the government said, okay, we're paying you that amount. Now, my economist friends got very upset. They're still taking, I said, yeah, but you know what happened. And the landowners claimed they were being, I won't say it. But I thought that was rather neat. In 1954, Nasser became the president of the new Republic of Egypt. He was in charge. To complement land reform, Nasser pushed for the construction of the ASWAN High Dam, create more arable land and cheap electricity for the country. And in that same year, initiated talks with the United States and the World Bank. Now, last was SUEZ. For Nasser, who was the first native-born Egyptian to become head of state in at least a millennium, Egypt was for Egyptians and was Arab. Therefore, Egyptians should govern their own affairs. In fact, he went further. Arabs should be able to govern their own affairs, because he was also a pan-Arabist, free of outside control. Now, there was a new treaty negotiated with Britain, but that would shorten the amount of time Britain would be in Suez. But in 1955, because of this view, Egypt not only refused to join the Baghdad Pact, which was a British anti-Soviet alliance, but also riled others or condemned other states, Arab states that would do so. Moreover, they were able to secure arms from Czechoslovakia, which tended to be Soviet arms, but it was Czechoslovakia. But prior to buying these arms, the United States agreed to support the building of the high dam at ASWAN. But the Egyptian rebuff of the Baghdad Pact, along with becoming one of the leaders in the non-aligned movement, caused the British, namely Anthony Eden, great consternation. And they were joined by the French, who were upset with the Egyptians, and especially Nasser, because of Egypt's support for revolts in both Tunisia and Algeria. Cairo radio was a very strong state-owned radio station, and liberation leaders were given lots of airtime, both in the Middle East and Africa. But things came to a head in July of 1956 when Nasser was actually flying back from a non-aligned pact visit, when President Eisenhower withdrew support, American assistance for the ASWAN. This was advised by Dulles, John Foster Dulles, who was known, or where the term brinksmanship became associated with, feeling that this, of course, would undermine Nasser's rule in Egypt. But Nasser came back. On the 26th of July of 1956, he announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. Now, this was very well received within the region, and especially by Egyptians. It did not go down so well with the British and French. And Eden, by this time, had become paranoid about Nasser and never liked him, because he said, well, he's not a true Arab. Why? So who talked to me about Gertrude Bell earlier? Yes, because a true Arab is a Bedouin. This still held true with them. Now, Bedouins constitute less than, or the nomads, less than 3% of the Arab world at this time, even less so now. The US response was more muted, except it did agree with many Europeans who said, Egyptians can't run the canal. There was this kind of down the nose business. We said the same thing about Panamanians later. Oh, they can't run the canal. Third world people can't do it. After a series of conferences, meetings, both overt and covert, Britain, France, and Israel decided to take back the canal, with Israel securing the east side of the bank and France providing, and Britain providing naval and airborne support. Egypt lost the battles, but Nasser won the war. Because with this war, kind of the last fang of the British Punch cartoon, last fang of the British lion, the United States and the Soviet Union demanded the withdrawal of all forces, including the Israeli forces from Gaza and Sinai. This actually was the only major US rejection of an Israeli action in the history of the conflict. Later, the Soviet Union agreed to build the high dam. But with this, Nasser is, Nasser has become really the chief statesman in the Arab world. And this was reached its zenith in 1958 when Syrians requested that he become the president of Syria and that they joined together in what became the United Arab Republic. Now this didn't last long, but at this point you have both Pan-Arabism and Nasser hailed as the savior, the man in the white horse. And that same year, a military coup in Iraq ended the monarchy and British influence in the country. Now, what we see in what happened in Egypt, Nasser's support lasted until the second Arab-Israeli conflict of 1967, where he was to engage in brinksmanship of his own, but it didn't work. And we'll take that up the next time and also look at the question of dictators, but I want to have some time for folks to ask questions or make comments. Yes, sir.
I want to ask a question about the Palestinian state. You know, we heard recently about the guy who came to address the United Nations, said it's time for Palestine to have a state. Well, in looking at your slides, they did have a state going back in history. Did they lose it in the Arab revolt there in 19, whatever that was?
No, the question was that the Jews did have a state in Palestine in history, but that...
My question is, was Palestine ever a state?
It was a mandate, so it was a colony in the same sense as mandated territory that Jordan was, and Iraq started out to be, and Syria and Lebanon, and Libya. It was a League of Nations mandate, which was really the same as a colony, except that the mandate authority, be it British or French, was supposedly responsible to the League of Nations. So they would have to report every year. It somewhat limited their action, but not by very much in terms of arbitrary and capricious behavior.
But in that one country, like their own government, their own flag, their own bureaucracy,
No.
parliament, or whatever.
The government of Palestine was the British. And Palestine remained essentially under direct rule. There was an attempt to create a council by the British didn't recognize the Arabs created a council and the Jews created the Zionist executive. The British didn't recognize the Arab Council because it included Christians, and they saw it as clearly just Muslim. So they created another council, but it would have essentially Jewish membership would be almost on par with Arab membership. I'm sorry, with Muslim membership. And then there were 2 places for Christians. But no one accepted it. And so they essentially, it was the called High Commissioner, but in fact was the same as a governor, say, in the Gold Coast.
If you have people stand when they ask questions, you might have a prayer period.
Oh, okay. If you can't stand, you can't ask the question. But that's okay. Yes?
My question is, which of the North African countries was originally a colony of Italy?
Libya. Next door. I'm sorry. The only country in the region, immediate region, that was a colony, that became a colony of Italy, which we talked about last week, was Libya. Although they resisted for a long, long time.
One more. Talking about Palestine again and the Palestinian refugees. I've heard or read that when Israel was formed, Israel, the Jews, they took land that belonged to the Palestinians. And so then they left as part of this refugee problem. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. There were two lines in the 50s. The Israelis said that the Palestinians left to join forces to fight the Israelis. That was it. That's the only thing that created the Exodus. The Arabs said that the Palestinians were pushed out. A good moderate would say, well, both are correct from the outside. But in fact, there were more pushed out, either through intimidation, and intimidation was such, a few massacres, people are Irgun, especially the Irgun massacres, were intimidated. Also, you had the spread of land. So you did get, there was so-called Plan D that did more pushing and less saying, oh, stay in place, we like you. So that you ended up with 700 refugees. Now, you also ended up with one other phenomena, which wasn't any Palestine, because Abdullah then annexed the West Bank to Transjordan, and we dubbed it the Kingdom of Jordan. So the only Palestinian entity was in Gaza, which actually remained pretty much separate from Egypt, but poor. So yes, you did have. Now, what happened to the others? Now, for a number of people, they say, well, because the other argument, they're all Arabs. What difference is it whether they're in Palestine or in Lebanon or in Syria? Well, for most people, it makes a big difference. Would you like to be forced to live in New Jersey? Anyone from New Jersey? I had a lot of students in my Arab-Israeli conflict class that were from New Jersey. They tended not to like that line, but.
I'm not a historian, but there's rumor that said that in 1948, at the conflict, when the Arab League felt so sure that they would defeat the Israelis, at that point, they told their Palestinian friends, you can leave for a short time, but you can be assured that in a very short time, you can return to your homes, to your homelands.
There was some of that.
Is there any truth to that?
There's some,
because
yes.
I hear rumors that, yes,
Yeah.
you'll be back, because we will push the Israelis into the sea.
Right. There were some cases of that, but when people went back, including Israeli historians, because the archives are now open. The Israeli archives are open. And many Israelis, historians, Benny Morris and others that have looked back at this, said no, most were pushed or intimidated.
Well,
Not many people left. Now, the primary people who left were upper class because there was a war and they had an easy means of going someplace else. But in terms of regular Palestinians, no, very few of them left to join these forces. But yes, they were glib. They said, oh, this should, we don't accept this. And the Arab forces were not very well equipped. They were National Guard units. I mean, the British, who were principal supplier at this time, did not equip them with very good weapons. There were maybe 20 aircraft at most.
Didn't they know that the Israelis were well fortified and had great armaments that they could have come against an possible force? Did they not realize it, or were they just so dumb?
Well, it's not that, remember these were paramilitary forces. You didn't have an the Israeli Defense Force came into being the day of independence. And then it brought in under its wing, the military wing, even more military wing was Palmark, but brought in Irgun, some elements of Irgun and Stern Gang. So you didn't see them on the ground, and there were more Arabs. So they thought it would, yes, they clearly thought, no one goes to war by saying, we're going to go to war and we know we're going to lose. And almost everyone who goes to war, including, us, says, it'll be over in just a few minutes, a few days, for whatever reason. But you didn't have, there was jealousy among the heads of state, Abdullah, King Farouk, and others, very poor logistics, not very good arms, and so they lost.
Two questions, and maybe next time, if there's not enough time. One is, what is the Baghdad Pact? And two, what is the significance of those particular areas in the division of Israel, or Palestine, whichever?
First thing, the Baghdad Pact was a sponsored pact by early 1950s. The United States and Britain had really adopted a containment policy against the Soviet Union. And NATO was one of them. SEATO would be another. The Baghdad Pact was a British-sponsored pact in Iraq, because Iraq was still a monarchy and still, which was supported by Nouri al-Said, who had been actually a prime minister in Iraq. His first time was 1922. An anti-Soviet pact. And the Egyptians and others argued this was actually this is another way for the British to retain control in the region. And so the Nasser and others argued against it. It really didn't work. The pact didn't last very. The Arab League, which was also sponsored by the British, Anthony Eden proposed it actually just before the war, did come into being, but without the British. And the Arab League was the.
Was there much discussion in the U.S. regarding the recognition of Israel?
The president what?
Was there much discussion when the U.S. recognized Israel as an independent?
Well, there was dissent in government.
What was the question?
Was there any dissent in the U.S. over U.S. recognition of Israel? As I said, it was split, but mainly around party lines. Republicans tended not to support it because a number said, well, these are socialists. That was one of the reasons the Jews are socialists, which is one of the reasons the Soviets supported it. They said, oh, we might be able to do something with that. The left did support it in both the United States and Europe. Was it a contentious? Truman became quite convinced, and so it was not it was not a divisive debate in the United States. And there was, you have to remember one other thing. I'll get to your other question, but the UN was new. And people were thinking the UN could do more than it could. People would listen to this. Now, you had another question about the lands that were the, I left it over here. The land, the fertile land, the most fertile land in the area is the coast. Then next, the West Bank. And then, actually, north of Beersheba, about here down, is really desert. Now, the Jewish interests, and one of these was Rabbi Silver of Cleveland, who was a neighbor of mine, argued for the Negev because they wanted a port that would become near Aqaba, and they built Eilat, which was a port there in the Gulf of Aqaba. Yes, there's.
I understand that there was a relatively small Christian population in Palestine, but much more significant than is in that area today. How were they dealt with?
Christian Arabs were also pushed out. They were Arabs. They tended to be Arabs. And about by that time, in 1920, it was about 10%. It had fallen to about 8% by 1948 because of the rise of Jewish immigration, so that the numbers, yes. But they tended to sympathize with, remember, there was a cultural thing here. The Jews weren't just seen as Jews. That wasn't the issue. They were seen as Europeans. This is, from the Arab perspective, imposition or continuation of European rule. They were European. And now what this prompted was emigration increased, and with the disaster, then there was pressure on Jews to leave Arab states, and they were being wooed by the Israelis to leave Arab states because they wanted more people. Yes, Paul.
You mentioned the term Irgun several times. What was that, or who were they?
The Irgun, as Lumi, was an offshoot of the Haganah, right-wing offshoot of the Haganah. And in fact, in started by someone else, but by the late 40s, it was under Menachem Begin. And they were very much involved in the terrorists. And the Stern Gang, now, the Irgun attacked people. The Stern Gang, which was another offshoot, attacked infrastructure. So in terms of the killing of people, both British and civilians and Arabs in the 1940s, and this is actually where the intimidation began. I mean, these terrorist Jewish groups, in terms of intimidating the Arabs, had started by 1946.
So the Irgun were Jewish?
Yes, as was the Stern Gang.
So why did they bomb the King David Hotel?
It was the headquarters of, or many British officers were in the King David Hotel. So, but there were many civilians in the King David, including some Americans.
Well, I'm just curious. I think President Obama recently said something about to mediate peace over there. They got to go back to the 1967. Is that 1967 boundaries?
No, we'll see that next week. I didn't get that far. That's the next topic. So,
Thank you. Thank you. Where's your laser pointer? Is this it?
pardon me?
Is this the